Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly brilliant structural analysis of American Christianity from Denzel Kenobi's recent essay, Honoring with Lips Part 2, The Unfinished Reckoning. If you've ever wondered about the massive gap between public religious rhetoric and actual foundational texts, well, this is for sure the deep dive for you. We're going to look at how certain structural patterns repeat themselves all throughout history.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the core pattern, Amos and civil rights, the modern debate, rhetoric versus scripture, the prophetic diagnosis, and finally, the unfinished reckoning.
Our source material today is part 2 of Kenobi's commentary, published in July of 2026. What makes this essay so compelling is how it impartially examines the gap between public religious identity and actual biblical texts. You know, Kenobi isn't making partisan attacks here. Instead, he's acting a lot like an architect inspecting a building. He's looking closely at how public arguments are built and pointing out exactly where the foundation might just be completely missing.
Section 1. The core pattern, the costume of failure. Kenobi argues that throughout history, there's a very specific failure that pops up whenever religious identity is used for public power. The mechanism itself doesn't really change, just its, costume. He illustrates this using the prophet Isaiah, who describes a people honoring with their lips, their heart removed. It's this striking idea that a group can build a massive, impressive monument of public piety, but when you look at the actual blueprint, the scriptural text itself, the requirements for justice are just completely missing.
Section 2. Amos and Civil Rights, Breaking the Silence. When we apply this exact pattern to the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, this structural gap becomes glaringly obvious. On one hand, you had 2 centuries of elaborate theological labor, like using the curse of Ham from Genesis 9 to actually justify segregation in the South. But sitting completely ignored on those exact same altars was Amos 5:24, demanding that justice roll down like waters. So all this energy was spent building theological cover, while the explicit mandate for justice was met with total silence.
And that brings us to a crucial point. The text wasn't missing. Amos 5 was sitting right there in every single Bible in the segregated South. It was an intentional preaching absence. Ezekiel 33 actually describes this perfectly. People who hear the words but intentionally go out and do whatever they please anyway. When leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. finally preached Amos 5 publicly, it didn't just introduce a new idea, it exposed that the scriptural indictment against segregation had been sitting there, actively ignored, the entire time. It functioned exactly as a structural indictment of avoided worship.
Having seen this mechanism at work so vividly in our history, we have to ask the natural next question. How does the author see this exact same pattern operating in our current era? If this mechanism just changes its costume, what does it look like right now?
Section 3. The modern debate, a new costume.
So how does this translate to contemporary policy? Let's take a look at the movement known today as Christian nationalism. According to our source, this is defined as the fusion of national identity with a specific religious identity to explicitly order civic structure. Now, we need to pause here for a second. Kenobi insists we carefully separate this civic, legal concept from an individual's personal faith.
This explainer is strictly focusing on public, national religious identity. The author isn't arguing that individuals are insincere in their private beliefs. That's completely outside our scope today. Instead, we're looking at public rhetoric that slaps a religious label onto a project of civic authority. And we're asking, do the foundational texts actually authorize that project?
Section 4. Rhetoric versus Scripture, the immigration debate.
To illustrate this modern costume, Kenobi points directly to the contemporary immigration debate. Just like in the segregation era, there is a stark, undeniable contrast between prevailing political rhetoric and the plain sense of specific scriptures. When biblical values are invoked in the abstract to support restrictive border policies, the concrete texts regarding the treatment of outsiders are, conspicuously left out. Just look at these specific texts. Leviticus 19 explicitly commands that the stranger dwelling in the land is to be treated as native-born and loved as oneself. Matthew 25 places the treatment of the stranger at the absolute center of religious identification, stating that what is done to the least of these is done directly to the divine. What's absolutely essential to understand here is that these aren't obscure verses requiring strained, complex interpretations. They are direct, repeated commands. Yet they sit completely unused by the very rhetoric claiming to be biblically grounded, whenever the desired policy runs in the other direction.
Section 5. The prophetic diagnosis, faith without works.
So how do the source texts diagnose this exact behavior?
Well, Kenobi uses this powerful framing from Titus 1:16 to show that a public identity producing confident rhetoric, but failing to execute commanded treatment, is basically a voided ritual. If a movement declares devotion but ignores the direct commands of Matthew 25 regarding the vulnerable, the ancient prophets wouldn't call it a partial success. No, they would call it a completely voided performance, a costume.
When you break it down, it's a completely predictable two-step formula used over and over again. Step 1, mobilize massive theological labor to support a predetermined political goal, whether that was the doctrine of discovery, segregation, or modern nationalism. Step 2, ensure a total, conspicuous absence of that same labor when it comes to clear scriptures that would interrupt that goal. It's a highly effective, recurring structural mechanism.
Section 6. The Unfinished Reckoning. Sealing the Truth.
So where does this incredibly sharp analysis leave us today? The author's ultimate profound takeaway is this. It's not that Scripture has failed America. Rather, the texts have been remarkably, consistently right. The Bible predicted exactly where this gap would open, right between the empty lips of public performance and the absent heart of actual justice. The terms of the covenant haven't failed. They've simply been left unpreached, while the performance continued on stage in their place.
Kenobi concludes his essay with this ancient charge from the book of Habakkuk. Write the words and seal with the seal of truth. This serves as a powerful reminder that the true terms have always been available. They've been sitting on the altar for centuries, literally just waiting to be properly enacted, rather than selectively edited for political convenience.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider the next time you hear religious identity invoked in the public square. When we look at the gap between what is claimed and what is practiced, we have to ask, will modern public rhetoric finally align with the plain demands of its source texts, or will those texts remain merely honored with the lips?